Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, which is the first of our webinars for 2021. My name is Megan Stewart. I'm a client director at Vantage Performance, and today we are presenting why we need high trust cultures with our guest, Phil Allison from Corporate Edge. And as always, we'll be hosted by our very own Kevin Higgins. So just a little housekeeping before we get started for those who haven't joined one of our webinars before. We've got 30 minutes of content to cover, followed by questions. So if you have any questions during the presentation, I strongly encourage you to type them into the question box in the Zoom control panel. You'll see on the screen there's a diagram with a little arrow to where you can type your question in. I'll see them during the presentation, and if relevant, we'll ask during the webinar. However, we will have the 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the session to answer questions. So I'll now hand over to Kevin. He's our Executive Director in Queensland, and he'll introduce Phil.
Thanks, Megan, and welcome again to the Vantage Resilience Series, where we discuss strategies for making businesses stronger, more resilient. One of the pillars of our fast track program is leadership and governance. And we've actually, today we're going to be talking about how people are dealing with trust in organizations, what happens if you don't get your buy-in from your team, and all things trust related. So today we're going to be joined by Phil Allison, and Phil's Managing Director of Corporate Edge. He's got 21 years experience in retail in Australia, New Zealand and Singapore, and he has obviously experience in strategic partnering, facilitation, coaching, leadership development, and at Corporate Edge. So he's previously worked in operations, general manager of operations in and regional director of a $2.4 billion business prior to Corporate Edge, and has worked with Woolworths, Dairy Farmers International. So he's really created and facilitated a lot of successful strategic workshops for both senior and middle management over the years. And he's also a sought after conference speaker presenting on culture, leadership, coaching, and behavioral change. Welcome, Phil.
Thanks, Kevin. Happy to be here.
So we might actually, as tradition would have it, we'll start off with a poll just to make sure that everyone's alert and with us. Now the poll today is around trust, and the particular question we're going to be asking is, do your team members know about one another's personal do your team members openly admit their weaknesses and mistakes to people? So rarely, sometimes, usually. That poll's coming up now, so if you want to just rank it. So team members, do they openly admit their weaknesses and mistakes? So we'll give you a few seconds just to complete that, and then we shall
Yep, so we've got about 65% of votes in now, so we'll give it another 10 seconds or so, and then we'll close that off. So rarely, sometimes, or usually. Okay, and we'll close that off there. So you'll see the results come up on your screen now. Quite a mixed bag there. We've got 63% answering sometimes, 25% rarely, and 13% usually.
Well, okay. Interesting. Well, Phil, what's your kind of thoughts on that? And generally speaking, what do you actually look for in a leader, which kind of plays into those results?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Look, it's really interesting and really not unusual, because this is a question that we ask of leadership teams all the time when we do our alignment workshops. And it's one of many questions we do ask, but it really starts to talk to the level of vulnerability an individual feels that they can have within a team. So if you're working in, whether it's a leadership team or whether you're working in a normal team, am I actually feeling comfortable, safe to say that I'm not coping, or I don't know what I'm doing? Can I put my hand up and let people know that I need help or support at any stage? And as you can see, they're 13% as usually, which is great for those. But the other sort of 87% are in the sometimes and rarelys. And we need to think about the impact that has on the business if we've got people out there that are maybe not coping right now or not feeling confident in what they're doing, and but they're not actually feeling comfortable to say what's happening. And so when you start to think about leadership, and you look at leadership as primarily being a person that from the essence of leadership has a vision and inspires people to follow, right? Because that's leadership, you're leading. So this is where we're taking the organisation, and you're able to get people to get on the journey and to say, I really want to be part of that. So that becomes the first part of leadership, is being able to do that. But the second part of leadership, and in fact what we believe is the most important part of leadership, and the number one outcome of leadership, is a thing called cooperation. And that means that we're getting people to work together and feel comfortable with each other. And so part of this vulnerability is the ability to connect with others. So when you look at vulnerability, sort of going back to that question, the ability or the feeling that I can be vulnerable within my organisation or within the culture, if I can't do that, then I can't really encourage trust. I can't build trust. But the problem is, of course, to be vulnerable, often we need trust. And so very much from a leadership point of view, is actually creating that platform or foundation for people to feel comfortable to speak up. Now, there's a very sort of famous Google study, research study, where they were looking at how to make sure that you could, what was the essence of an outstanding project team. And it's called Project Aristotle, if anyone wants to Google the Google project. What they found in the end, Julia Rosensky found anyway, one of the researchers, was that what made outstanding teams outstanding is a thing called psychological safety. And in fact, that meant that people felt comfortable to speak up, so that there was no time where people in the project team didn't understand exactly where that project was at a given point, where, what was working and what wasn't working, what was falling behind, and any other issues it may have had. So what it meant, what she observed in those teams, was that people were really wanting to work together. They cared about each other. They talked freely about each other. They talked freely about their personal lives. And clearly there was this high level of cooperation. And so from a leader's point of view, or our ability to lead, it's how do we get people working together? How do we know the definition of a team is working together to achieve a common goal. How do we actually get them to work together to achieve that vision? And so from a leader's point of view, it is, what do I need to do to make that happen? And that becomes the critical thing.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So vulnerability creates trust in some respects from what you said.
Correct. But vulnerability needs trust.
Yeah, that's right. That's something that our politicians lack, don't they? They lack that vulnerability to admit their mistakes, and therefore no one trusts politicians effectively. I think it's probably
correct. It's very hard to trust them because you don't actually believe what they're saying, because they're not being as honest as they can be.
Yeah, interesting. Trust is an important element in culture. How have you seen the way people are dealing with trust in organisations?
Yeah, so it's leading on to that. So, really what we've seen is a significant shift from the 20th century, probably late 20th century into the 21st century, of cultures having to shift significantly to attract talent, so to get the best people working in there. And a lot of that has been built on culture. Having a purpose and having the right values that people align to. But saying this is our culture and describing your culture is one thing. Leading the culture is a whole nother thing. So we say that there's three things that leaders must do to ensure that they can build the right culture, which eventually will build the right level of trust. So the first thing is that they must communicate the expectations. So you have to actually go out there and tell people what it is we stand for. What are we focused on? What are our business or strategic priorities? And how do we do it? Behaviourally, what do we expect of people from a values point of view? So communicate the expectation, number one. The second thing, you need to role model the expectations. This comes back to that leadership question. What are you looking for in a leader? You're looking for someone who walks the talk, someone who absolutely believes in the culture that they're articulating to the client, to the team, and then they do it. And so it's not a matter of I do as I say, it's do as I do, because in the end, culture is leader-led. And what that means is people will observe leadership and say, what is the real culture here? What is the real expectation? So the first thing, communicate the expectation. Second one, role model the expectation. But then the third one is about holding others accountable for the expectation. So it's not just about knowing what it is. It's not about seeing leaders do it. It is about being held accountable and people holding each other accountable. So if you don't have a high trust culture, then holding people accountable becomes something that's very difficult. We worry about whether people are going to react in the right way. Excuse me, I'm just going to move this slide over a little bit here to just take a bit of light off my shoulder. Whether they're going to react in the right way. And so, you know, holding others accountable is about the fact if we say we're going to do something, if we say this is our culture, we say this is the way we're going to behave, then in fact, I'm going to hold you accountable for that. You know, I'm going to, if I see you behaving in a different way, I'm going to just pull you up and give you some feedback. So it's not going to be anything dramatic, but just sort of let you know, hey, that's not the way we do it here. And so really building high trust cultures is critical to our success because we know it's critical to engagement. We know engagement is critical for discretionary effort. And we know that discretionary effort is pretty much the difference between great organisations and good organisations. So it is really about leadership behaviour because culture is leader-led. It is really about, from the CEO down, how do we behave?
Yep, yeah, and I guess it's about the team members holding each other to account as well. So,
yep,
you know,
that's exactly right.
It's not about the CEO just, you know, ensuring that there's accountability. It's actually the management team themselves holding themselves to account.
Correct.
And
but it's also team members holding team members to account, you know, and so having the trust to do that, the courage to do that, to say to someone, hey, look, that's not the way we do it here. I remember you know, working with an organisation that was working on culture, and they were doing work with BP internationally, and BP were obviously have a high safety culture, and they were concerned about the fact that it was all about governance. It was all about the fact we're trying to make people be safe, and it wasn't working. They were losing people, you know, on oil rigs, they were losing people in refineries and serious accidents. And they're saying we're just not winning the war on safety until someone sort of worked it out and said, well, it's not really about making people do safety, it's about people believing that safety is important. But more importantly, that peers, team members are holding each other accountable for safety. And so from a cultural point of view, how do we go out there and get everyone to understand that it is everybody's responsibility to make sure that everybody gets home safely, that we have families. And so it's not, you know, rather than allowing a person not to, you know, wear their harness or to do something unsafe, is to call them out and sort of say, look, you know, the reason why I'm doing it is I care about you. And how do you get people to understand that that's everybody's role? And so it's a really good indication of what high trust cultures do, is they sort of allow people to call each other out and, you know, fundamentally get to that point of saying that we're accountable for making sure that the culture is what we want it to be.
Yeah. It's like change of direction, but you hear a lot and you read a bit about enterprise thinking.
Yep.
What does that mean, and what's your view on it?
So we're really big on enterprise thinking. So an analogy that I created many years ago is the village. Trying to describe the type of cultures that are successful in the 21st century, rather than trying to have various cultures and different ways of doing it, is to sort of say if there was one overarching belief on culture that would work for most organisations, what would it be? And we call it the village. And the reason why is because we've lived in villages or in communities for tens of thousands of years. It's really inherent in humans to want to belong to a community. We want to do that. So why is it that in organisations we had moved away, you know, fundamentally in the 19th and 20th century, moved away from the village and put everything into being just around productivity, about getting the most out of individuals and you know, calling them resources and assets and capital, and removing the humanity around it. And so what the village does is the village brings us back to being human. It brings us back to the fact that we have needs, and we all have, you know, similar sorts of needs, and we need to support each other and care about each other. And so what we know from villages, if you think about a successful village 300 or 400 years ago, What made it successful was that everybody had a role and everybody did their role. And the reason why they did their role is because they got a really simple fact, is that we couldn't succeed independently of the village. What that means is we can only succeed if the village succeeds. So our job is to make the village successful. And what that means is we all have food, we all have water, we all have warmth, we all have shelter, we all have clothes, we all have tools, all our children are looked after by the elders and are taught and given, passed down the wisdom. And because everyone's doing everything for the success of the village rather than the success of us as an individual, the village worked. And so when we think about that in a modern day context, that's about enterprise thinking. Is that as an individual, you don't succeed independently of the success of the organisation. And so right from the leadership team down, this is about saying, if I'm on an executive team, I'm on a leadership team, if any part of the business fails, then I'm failing, irrespective of how successful my division or my department is. Right. And so we own the success of the whole enterprise, not the success just of our own business. And we call this 1-2 thinking. That is putting the organisation before the department that you lead or the department that you work in or the job that you have. And we believe that's not exclusive to an executive team, is that every team member in the organisation, if we can imagine getting everyone engaged to a level where they were all completely aligned to the success of the business, if they were thinking about what they're doing right now and what does that mean to the overall success of the organisation, what sort of impact would that have? And what we see that is it has a tremendous impact. People care to a whole nother level and they want to add value to a whole nother level.
Yeah, I guess you'd see people in organisations, senior managers attending their senior management meeting and really trying to defend their turf and defend their team if anyone puts scrutiny on their team. But this type of mentality, what you're talking about, is really, well, let's agree on the overarching, I guess, plan. Let's all be on the same page there, and then you can disseminate that kind of culture and kind of leadership down into your team.
That's exactly right, Kevin. So what we do, that we call that 2-1 thinking. 2-1 thinking is when you put the area you work or the role that you do in front of the organisation. And so it's natural to do that because you can believe that's why you're employed. If you look at your business card, you'll see a title on there saying, you know, if you're a leader, you know, head of this department or whatever it is. And so you think, well, that's what they want me to do. And they do. You know, there's work you need to do in that area. But when you have a 2-1 mindset, what happens is that you see your role so much as looking after that, is that you want things to be right in that area there, even if they might not be right for the organisation. And if someone challenges you, you defend your turf, you defend your department or your function. But the fact is, if you're in part of leadership, we need to be challenging all the time. So, for example, if we're looking for change, right, we're looking for growth, we're looking for something to change, there is no change without challenge, right? All change starts with challenge. You have to challenge something for something to change. And so challenge has got to be a part of our culture. It's got to be a part of our everyday way that we run our business. So every time you're challenged by someone, that is because they're wanting the business or wanting the area, wanting something to get to another level. Instead of defending that, we need to absolutely embrace it. But if you come from a 2-1 mindset, you feel like they're challenging you and your department by saying that you're not doing a good job, when in fact they're just saying, well, you know, the project's running a little bit behind. What do we need to do to get it moving? That's not a criticism of an individual. That's just saying it's a fact. We need to do something about it. And yet from a 2-1 mindset, Kevin, people always defend. They always defend. And it creates a problem where, in the end, going back to our vulnerability piece, if a person constantly defends, and they do that by deflecting, usually blaming someone else, if they're going to continue to defend and deflect, people stop challenging. And in the end, they don't feel safe to be vulnerable enough or courageous enough to challenge anymore. So if you then think of that from a business growth point of view, from an innovation point of view, from a collaboration point of view, all of those things just drop away.
There's got to be a certain level of tension at that management meeting to allow some change to happen. If there's no tension, then there's nothing happens. Another interesting, I guess, interesting review on this. So in a lot of our turnarounds, one of the first things that we have to look at is, you know, has do we have the right team there? Is there people who are kind of dissenters, or the people that are going to promote the turnaround plan and go forward with it? So what happens if the team hasn't bought into the program? It doesn't necessarily have to be a turnaround program, but a program of some nature. What if you have some people that are kind of sitting outside and don't buy into it?
So there's probably two sides to that question, Kevin. The first one is if the team hasn't bought in, so broadly said the team hasn't brought in, then there's something wrong with leadership. That's a leadership problem. We're not communicating the vision. We haven't created a vision that people say, I get it. You know, I was working with someone this morning, a CFO of an organisation, and she's only been in there a short time, and she's just about to get her team together to really challenge the business and you know, try and get them to be more engaged in and involved in creating the new, right? And so I said, well, you know, what's your vision, right? If you don't have a vision, what are you moving towards? Because if we understand that we have a current state, and we're saying now that the current state isn't where we want to be, well, we've got to create a future state so that there is something we're aiming for. When you create a future state, you describe your current state and then you create a future state, you create a gap between the two. That gap is the thing that shows that we've got somewhere to go. We need to do something differently. And so from a leadership point of view, if we haven't successfully done that, then people won't get on board. So that's the first thing. How well have you been able to describe the current state and the future state to a point where people have said, yeah, wow, I get it, we need to change. And at that point, as soon as they do that, they're on board, right? Then they'll just, you know, look at the gap and think, what are the things that are stopping us? And then what's the plan to close the gap? How do we move forward, right? Pretty simple. But the reality is, you're never going to get 100% of people on board. And particularly when you're going off in a different direction, you would normally then want to challenge some parts of your culture. And so when I've worked with executives, with CEOs and MDs that have brought us in to really look at their culture and articulate it and start doing some culture change work, the first question I always ask them is, are you prepared to lose your very best employee? So that person might be a member of the executive team. They might be your number one salesperson. They may be your head of logistics. They might be, you know, something. But you today consider them to be awesome at what they do. They're great at their job. Are you prepared to let them go? Because if you're not, then you can't go on the culture journey. The reason why I say that is because you've got a person today that is succeeding in a culture that you're saying isn't quite right, or succeeding in a direction that isn't quite right. Now, it doesn't mean you will lose those people. It doesn't mean they won't adapt. But if you're not prepared to challenge them, if they don't match up to the new way of doing things, if you don't challenge them because you're fearful of losing a gun employee, then everything else you're doing isn't going to work, right? Because no one believes in the culture, because, oh, you want us all to behave this way, but this person can behave that way, and that's okay. You're tolerating their behaviour. You're saying that they're okay because they're our number one salesperson. For goodness sakes, we can't afford to lose them. And so very much about this is identifying what we call the red dots. And the red dots are the ones that have a different way of operating. They might have an alternate view, and there's nothing wrong with the alternate view. We love alternate views. But they have an alternate view that they're not prepared to let go of, and they will not buy in to the direction that the leader and the leadership team has decided on doing. And they're not being part of that. They're saying, I want to go in a different direction. And what we know, if you can't turn a red dot into a green dot, if you can't bring them into the village, then you actually have to let them go. And so from an individual point of view, keeping people on board who are not culturally and strategically aligned is a huge mistake. And we only have to go back to the village over hundreds of years to see that villages would exile people who didn't fit in. That's just our ability to shake their hand. They're great people. It's not that they're not good people. Shake their hand, thank them for everything they've done, and wish them all the best in finding an organisation that suits their view of the world. Because if that doesn't suit ours, then they can't be there. So two sides to it. One is, first of all, we need to make sure we've set that expectation up, and we've really set up the path forward in such a way that people get it. It's clear and they buy in. And secondly, if someone says, yeah, that's not for me, thank them and move them on, and find people who are aligned.
I guess if those type of people stay, those red dots stay in the organization, they could probably act as a bit of maybe a cancer and
oh, no question.
spread their ideas to other people, and all of a sudden you've got kind of
What we see is a behaviour of divide and conquer. So what will happen is they will be ostracised, and it's human behaviour for us when we're ostracised, when we're isolated in a team or in a group of people, inevitably we start to get lonely. We feel like it doesn't feel comfortable. So our natural subconscious reaction to that is to divide and conquer. What does that mean? It's just to find people who are maybe having a bad day, maybe have been told that their idea is not a great idea. Maybe they're just, feeling a little unsure of something. And what we do is we get in their head, we speak to them and say, the leadership doesn't get this, they've got this wrong, these decisions are wrong, we're going down the wrong path. And we just get in their heads and we convince them to come on board with me, and get on board with my idea. And so they go around with as many people as they can. And if they're left in the business long enough, they'll keep doing it and doing it and doing it until they have the numbers to basically overthrow the leadership. And we've seen that, in the village over thousands of years. We see that in organisations today, where organisations are divided because this person has been able to go and build a whole groundswell against the direction and basically sabotaging the direction of the organisation.
Yes, important to call out that early. Now, I guess as a part of a coaching model, counterparts, they reflect a lot on their own kind of times, but should we be in the organization reflecting more on what we do, and how often should we reflect, if we should be doing that?
Yeah, we should always be reflecting, because this a bit comes back to the challenge thing. I think challenge should be a part of every culture. So the reflection is really about, where are we at? Are we heading in the right direction? Are we aligned to the way the world wants us to be in this day and age? And so what's happened over the last 50 years, and it's accelerated dramatically every decade and every year now, is the rate of change. And the rate of change isn't just technological change. The rate of change is behavioural or emotional change. And so what I've seen is the psychology of humans changed dramatically over the last 40 or 50 years, to the point now where I believe the majority of people are very values driven, and we see that, and they're very purpose driven. They're wanting to work with organisations that are also purpose driven, that their work matters, that they're contributing to something bigger than just the task itself and the outcome of the task. We're also seeing people, of course, that are concerned about the condition of the planet and the broader global issues that we face, like COVID. And so as organisations, we need to reflect whether, number one, our approach is aligned to the way people are thinking today, but whether or not we fit into that mindset, whether our strategy is taking into account the psychology of our teams, but also the psychology of our customers. We know, for example, that the millennials, the people that are born at the end of the 20th century, that have come through, that they went through kindergarten and preschools, putting in water tanks and organic gardens, and they grew up in their formative years of their 0 to 10 years with people telling them that the world is basically dying. We're overheating, and the polar caps are going to melt, and species are becoming extinct, and the continents are going to flood, and so it is really formative. These kids have grown up into eco-warriors, and organisations that don't adapt their strategy around some sort of ecological alignment are going to be seen as dinosaurs, and people won't want to work for them, but they won't want to buy from them either. And so you're seeing a lot of products come out, a lot of things now that have a corporate social responsibility attached to them, which is saying, hey, look, we're giving back and we really, really care. And to me, that's the thing. I think if there was one overarching word about leadership today, is the best leaders that I've worked with, the ones that I'm seeing make the most change, are the ones who care the most. Not care about company profits the most, but care about the holistic look at it. It's about the people, about the team. It's about what we do, the difference we make. And of course, the financial strength that we have, the success that we're having financially, but not as being the primary mover. And it becomes more about the team and the customer. It becomes more about people, caring about people, and creating the direction and the culture around that.
Yeah, it's important. I've seen one company's slogan is that it's our people are number one and our customers are number two.
Yeah, there was an old model called the business success cycle, which basically says you have a leader, you have your team, you have your customer, and you have success. So the leader leads the team to look after the customer, who looks after success, which looks after the leader. So it's a cycle, right? Which means the customer comes second. I've sort of evolved my thinking a little bit about that. I talk now more about people first cultures. And so if you have a people first culture, that means that all people matter. And so you can take in all stakeholders and they matter just as much as each other. The team matters just as much as the customers, matters just as much as suppliers or partners, matters just as much as the owners, the stakeholders. Everybody matters. And we need to care about every one of those groups equally. And when we do that, we create a culture that is really consistent in the way it behaves to every stakeholder.
There's a great book by Bob Chapman called Everybody Matters, on his Barry Waymiller in the States. So yeah, no, it's a good point. We'll leave, I guess on that point, we've reached our half-hour point. So at that stage, we'll take some questions. So I might go to Megan now and see if there's any questions come through.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And thanks, Phil. I know we could talk to you for hours, but we only gave you half an hour. So here we are. So encourage everybody to type their questions into the question and answer module at the bottom of your screen. We do have some interesting questions so far, so we'll get into those. Firstly, we've got a question from Tim. He's asking, do you not need some red dots within an organisation to ask questions of senior leaders and management, challenge the culture, bring innovation, and in turn build trust?
Yeah, great. That's a great question, because that often in my explanation of red and green dots, and I didn't really talk too much about the green dots, that question comes up frequently. I'm glad you've asked it, Tim. No, we don't want red dots. We want green dots. So where the delineation is there is a person who challenges leadership, challenges the direction, challenges the status quo, is a green dot. That's not the thing that makes them red. We want that. We love alternate views. We love challenge. That's what I was saying before. We need to create a challenge culture. We need everyone to feel courageous enough to say what they think. The red dot is a person who, when they've been heard, and the decision goes against them, there's a different direction. The red dot can't let it go. Now, that's okay. Even that doesn't on its own make them a red dot. But when the red dot starts to agitate against the current direction outside of the forums like the leadership meetings or other meetings that are set up to challenge, when they're going behind the back and they're trying to convince other people to divide and conquer and overthrow the decision, that becomes divisive behaviour. And it splits the organisation, which is why we don't want the red dot. We want that behaviour to be green. We want it to be constructive. I remember back in my executive days, I had this, what I thought was a brilliant initiative. I put it forward to the executive team, and to my horror, it was unanimously said, Phil, we're not ready, we're not going to do it. And I was so disappointed. But I had one of the exec come up after me a little while and said, Phil, you okay? You looked a little beaten up. I said, oh, look, I'm convinced we need to do this. This is absolutely the right thing to do right now. And he said, you're probably right. He said, we just got too much on. Looking at what we're already trying to do, it's just not the right timing. He said, here's a bit of advice. Come back in a couple of months, repackage it a little bit differently. Think about your approach, but don't let go of the idea. And I did. I took it back in a couple of months later to the executive team with a different approach, and we went ahead with the initiative. It's not about forgetting the idea, is about how you go about doing it. Red dots do it in a destructive way.
Further on the red dots, Phil, we've got a follow-up question in here from Scott asking, what methodology do you recommend for identifying red dots within the organisation?
Yeah, really interesting, because whenever I do this, and if I do this in large groups, sometimes I have 100 people in a room, and I'll ask them, has anyone got a red dot in their team, or can anyone think of a red dot right now? Everybody nods. What's really interesting is we do know these people. We haven't sort of picked them out and we haven't given them a title, if that makes sense. And remembering, I want to make perfectly clear, our goal for a red dot is to turn them into a green dot. We want them to stay. We want them to be part of the team. We want them to be constructive. We only exile them when, in the end, we just can't do it. They just won't buy into the direction we're going in, and we can't create a direction for one person. It has to be for the business. So we do identify these things, but we're looking for anything that looks like divisive behaviour. You know, the meeting after a meeting, a person who pulls people aside and is constantly getting in their ear and telling them that the decision's a bad decision. You know, a person that seems constantly agitated about the direction of the organisation, a person who seems to have that chip on their shoulder and who he just doesn't seem to be engaged, right? So they're largely disengaged. I think there's a number of ways of identifying them, but in the end, you know what? My experience is they stand out. They stand out the moment we understand that there is a category of people out there in a team that are behaving that way.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Phil. Okay, now we've got a general culture question from Graham. He's just commented that culture is often described as to how we do things around here, but isn't it also about why we do things around here?
Yeah, it's all about the why. So when I say that, it's about the why and it is about the how. So culture always starts with the why. So the why is purpose. The shift has been in the last 30, 40 years to organisations being many organisations going purpose-led. Now, all organisations should be purpose-led. If you're in an organisation now and you don't have a why or a purpose, or you're running one, you know, I'd strongly recommend you do it. You know, it allows you to align everything you do to what I call an end-to-end outcome, the result of everything to do. What is the end outcome? Why is the world a better place? Why are you relevant? Why do people need you? You know, it is not about what you do, it is about the outcome of what you do. And that's your why, right? That's, you know, if you lose your why, you lose your relevance. You lose your relevance, you don't exist. It's as simple as that. If people don't need you anymore, they don't use your services, they don't buy your products, you just don't exist. So making sure you know the why. But then the other part of culture is how we do it and the way we behave. It is the behaviours that are aligned as an organisation that enable the team to move forward or in a direction together, but together, you know, aligned in that direction in the same way. So that's really about the values. So the two core parts of culture, the two core parts are purpose and values.
Yeah, good. Okay, we've got another question that's quite timely and topical. So it's from an anonymous attendee. So pre-COVID, many employees were micromanaged and essentially forced to work in the office to advance their careers. As we all saw, post-COVID, organisations have had to trust their people to work from home. Do you think that employers will continue to trust their employees and allow them to work flexibly and away from the office? Or will we inevitably be monitored externally? And they've given an example of number of keyboard strokes, etc.
Yeah. So we're seeing both of those things. Look, the ideal world would be that, and I know people who did not trust and struggled with that, right? We call them trust earners. You would think that the example has shown that you can allow people to work flexibly, and I'm glad you used that word and not work from home. I'm not a strong believer in that we should allow people to work from home full time, because what we know is the impact on culture, the impact on connectiveness, the impact on mentorship, the impact on being able to challenge is largely greatly restricted by people working 100% from home. So, you know, our view, it's a hybrid, right? It's probably 3-2 or something like that. That's certainly what we do in my business. We work the team 3-2, 3 in the office, 2 at home. The thing is, I think that flexibility, though, the flexibility goes beyond that. It is around understanding that people might come in later, leave early. You know, it's okay to do pickups and drop-offs on certain days. It's other things you need to do, and trust that people are still going to get their job done. They're going to be able to work outside, and they'll make it work, right? The reality is, what we see, to your point, is that people. You know, I'm almost horrified that people are creating software and companies are buying it that are monitoring people. They do screenshots they can tell you how often you're sitting, how long of the day you're sitting in front of your computer. They're measuring your keystrokes, the number of keystrokes. And all this. I'm horrified at that because it is completely low trust, and that is micromanagement. I don't know that we were as micromanaged in a lot of organisations previously. I think those same organisations, if they were micromanaging before, are probably micromanaging now, and the high trust ones are probably high trust now. So really, you would like to think we've learnt that people can work from home, that we can have flexibility. I honestly believe that organisations that do not embrace flexibility moving forward are simply not going to attract the talent. And that's that, you know, in the end, that's at your detriment. You might think you're controlling things, but in the end, the more you try to control, the less success you have of it. Nature teaches us that you can't control things. So trust is a critical element of success, and belief that your people care, and your belief that people will do the right thing. So that's the idealistic view of it. But the reality is, I'm afraid there are managers out there, not leaders, managers who want to control, and it will be at their detriment, in my opinion.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. It's an interesting one for sure. So we'll probably just finish on one last question, and we might loop back to another red dot question, because like you say, that seems to strike a chord with almost all organisations. Yeah. So this is a slightly different angle, but the question is, rather than one or two red dots, what happens when there is a great team that is aligned, but they just don't share the leader's vision? After all, it is quite possible that the leader might be wrong, not the team.
Yeah, the leader might be the red dot. Absolutely. I know a client right now, you know, we're working in a part of the business, and two parts of the business that I know of, and two senior leaders would clearly argue that the leader is a red dot. And that's a concern, right? Because you don't get to pick the CEO. Someone else does that. My feeling always is that those people tend to get caught out eventually, especially these days. I think 20 years ago, there were a lot more of them, and they survived for a long time because we just tolerated that behaviour. I just don't think that, once again, talent will hang around. Both of these people that I'm working with at an executive level are looking for new jobs. They don't want to work in that environment. So it's possible that the leader's wrong. The problem is that the leader is the leader, they're the CEO, and if they're not willing to be challenged, if they're not okay with being challenged, my advice to someone is that I'd go work with somewhere that where there's trust, and where you're able to contribute to the success of the organisation. Because I guarantee when the leader's a red dot, the leader is once again managing the organisation, not leading it. They're trying to control it. There will be a level of micromanagement, certainly a high lack of trust. And that's just not fun. And they'll be able to tell the board or others all these other reasons why the business isn't succeeding. Eventually they get caught out, but often it takes a long time, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Phil. Okay, well, I'll just hand over to you to close out.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Megan. And yeah, maybe that CEO might need a coach or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's right. Exactly. On how to deal with that.
Yeah, before the employees all exit. All right, well, that was great. Thanks very much for that, Phil. That was really, I feel like we could probably talk all day on that, but some really interesting topics on trust, and yeah, really appreciate to do that. So thanks again, and we will we've got some other webinars coming up, but give us some feedback as well. There's a survey at the end of this, so hang around, give us a score, tell us what you want to hear about, and what we can improve on. And yeah, we've got some interesting topics coming up in the not too distant future. So we'll send an email out after this with this recording. And if you want to get in contact with Phil directly, you can either Corporate Edge, or you can come through us and we can direct you to Phil. And yeah, thanks again, Phil.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
All right. Cheers. Thank you.